All right, thanks for tuning in. You're listening to Gaucho Amigos. I'm Alex. Today, my guest is Zach Phillips. He's the co-leader and songwriter of the band Fievel is Gloak, a band I had never heard of until pretty recently. I guess they're ostensibly an indie rock band, but there's a strong jazz influence in their sound, so it almost comes across as indie jazz fusion, a somewhat unusual mix. A lot of their songs are in French. The other songwriter and lead singer, her name is Ma Clement, and I believe she's from Belgium. Quite a few of the band members are European. And apparently they opened for Stereolab on tour last fall, but I just discovered them earlier this year, and they're incredible. I've been digging into their latest album, which is called Flaming Swords, and also this video on YouTube where they're playing at Audio Tree Studios, and they blow through like 9 songs in 20 minutes. The songs are great. The musicianship is impeccable, and Ma's vocals are pretty stunning. So yeah, I really love this band. Anyway, I reached out to Zach on Twitter mostly to just tell him how much I've been enjoying his work, and we started chatting. And I discovered that he's more of a Walter Becker solo fan than a Steely Dan fan. Not something you hear too often. But we ended up doing a Gaucho Amigos chat in person, and it was great. Zach is very thoughtful about music and about the creative process and about Becker and Fagan. So thanks to Zach for taking the time to come and meet me in person to do this episode. And a very special shout out to my friend and former guest of this show, Winston Cook Wilson. He produced the episode and sat in on our conversation, and you'll hear him occasionally chime in. Without further ado, this is me and Zach Phillips of the band Fievel is Gloak. Enjoy.
There's something fusional about their relationship, and that's part of what I think is psychologically complex about the writing that came out. And I like that they're writers first and foremost. Even like, the lore is that they there's a bunch of records that aren't credited to them that they wrote, and they're Bard, immediately post Bard days. I don't know if there's a Dan verse that has figured out what those records are, but I feel like I hear them sometimes. I'm they probably wrote that. But I read an interview today preparing for this podcast where Walter, it was the lead from the article is it's a 90s interview, and the lead is they're talking about it being subversive, what they're trying to do, putting jazz harmony and weird ass cryptic lyrics and pop songs or whatever.
Yeah.
That's how they put it. But the part of the interview that interested me was just Walter Becker just being we just wanted to make harmonically complex music. We wanted harmonically interesting music, and we never really thought about genre or what it was for, and we don't really care. And I was like, yeah, that's really relatable.
Because that's what you do pretty much, right?
Yeah, just trying to find... I used to, when I was 21 or something, that I was trying to define, as one does when one's 21, what it's all for, what it's all about, or whatever. And the term I came up with was psychological modernism, right?
Okay.
The idea of modernism, which is art movements, that I take that, the resonance there is that you're modernists are trying to, I'm looking at the Borges book right there. Modernists are searching for novel, materialist novelty, right? Counterposed to maybe conceptual novelty and things like that. It's what can we do with these materials that would be novel and would be on the cutting edge of what we think is possible, and my idea was what I care about is trying to be on the cutting edge of what psychological effects and like how it feels and what would it feel like to say that in a song, or what would it feel like if that's dissonant in a way that I just don't understand. Things like that. And I really kind of like buried that and became embarrassed about it. But recently I've been more like, oh yeah, that's basically, that's all right. Yeah.
Like surprising yourself as much as the listener.
Yeah. Surprise. It's a cult of surprise. I mean, that's what art is to me. It's like, it's a heuristic cult of surprise. Like we're, striving to be shocked by something new.
What if I'm on your face? Was doubled by mistakes arrival to form an your disguise. Stage with lights on.
It's not just about attention to sound or attention to the performance. It's like you're actually doing representational work. You're like making decisions that transcend how they sound. It's like basically what do these decisions mean is a question that you might ask or you might not ask, but either way it's like that's happening. And putting yourself at somebody else's mercy for a live session, which you're always doing if you're not engineering it yourself, is kind of scary for me. And Audio Tree, like we didn't have any input into the mixing or anything like that.
So you just showed up there that day and it was all kind of set up for you?
Yeah, and they did a great job. I mean, they do it every day. They're pros. But that's really, really, like, I had to be kind of talked into it, because I was like, what do you mean I'm not going to have control of the representation?
What aspects of representation are you like specifically referring to?
It could be anything. Like it just really, like with Flaming Swords, that was all recorded live in one day. But there's a great deal of representational fuckery to make things feel, because people have it in their heads that you just and it makes sense. Like I don't know how certain things work. I don't know, there are a million processes that I'm not familiar with,
right.
So I'm not bemoaning like ignorance about the ins and outs of making recordings, but for people who haven't done it a lot. But and there's a lot of different ways to do it and to think about it. But what I would say is that like there is a tendency, people tend to think like you turn the mics on and you record it and then you like mix it to make everything sound better and then it's done, and that's not at least how I've ever made records at all. So what are you doing representationally? Well, here's the problem. Like the first Fievel album was recorded with like a little dictaphone cassette recorder from the 80s, I guess, with
and that was an intentional decision to do it that way, right?
No, well, it was an intentional decision to record all the rehearsals. And see, I'm like so nervous about recording. I'm like looking at that. Is it actually recording right now? The DAW isn't like, it's not moving. I'm used to like I'm really new to digital. Oh yeah, great. Now I can see it moving. Okay. I'm used to seeing like the tape, the tape actually turning. Yeah. No, it was a decision to record the rehearsals. And I thought it would be, I like making recordings on a Marantz cassette thing. And I had a history of like, recording this way. And it has a nice limiter on it, but that's like the only thing. So we would just set up like one $50 condenser mic and then do the Beatles trick of like having a dynamic mic, two dynamic mics taped together for Ma, the vocalist. And one of those is going into a mixer and mixing with the condenser mic, because this is being recorded in mono, because it doesn't even have stereo.
Oh, it was mono. Wow.
Yeah, and so I'm there with headphones on, like right now, kind of between takes, changing the vocal level and the condenser mic level, and like doing the mixer I had was like a Behringer that only had bass and treble EQ, not sweepable or anything. So there's like a lot of good performances that we did in rehearsals that like just the balance wasn't good, so we didn't use it. And the only reason we released an album of stuff recorded that way was, well, first of all, it sounded really cool and I liked it. And it was like, that was a representation that I couldn't really touch that much.
Okay.
You know, if it's mono, it's just a fucking recording of what happened. It's still not neutral. I think, you know, it's not neutral, but it's a lot different from having like 10 mics on the drums and like all this shit hooked up everywhere. You can think of them, all the mics, as being ears. And it's like, what would it be like if I told you how you're going to hear this show is going to be a combination of 20 different people standing in different places hearing it in different ways?
Right.
You would be like, that doesn't make any sense to me. And so that's what mixing is. It's somebody making that make sense.
I'm not determining what evidence showing until turning up and serving a meaning of criminal minds that fall away kind of decommitted much but no parents can see impairing them like a complete
I got hurt in Brussels when I was staying there, and I was there because of like a technicality in a union contract I had with the National Lawyers Guild. And I collided with like a street pole, and I mean, I like just whited out or whatever, like, but it was a good hit on the temple. And I, you know, if you've ever read, I grew up like, I read that book Holes. You remember that book? There's a kid who like gets hit like by a baseball bat or something, and then he has like a brain hemorrhage and he dies. And I that lodged in my mind, like, if you get hit on the temple, you need to get checked out. But I don't know how hospitals work over there and everything. I was worried about the expense and all that. So my friend was like, oh, I'll call my coworker. She trained as a nurse, and that was Ma, the singer and co-writer of 5 So she came over the next day, and we did Life After Love by Cher.
That was the one?
Yeah, and
why that song?
I don't know. We were just like, it was like, well, what songs do we know in common? And I was like, do you know this? Do you know that? I don't remember what they were, but she knew that one. And I was like, okay. And then we recorded on the Marantz. I have it.
So your collaboration is just this total fluke.
Yeah.
What's the songwriting process? I mean, what's the breakdown in terms of who's doing what?
Well, on God's Trash Men, it's really my writing, except for Decoy, which I guess is our most popular song. It's in
the audio tree too.
Yeah, and Ma wrote the lyrics to that. But after that, we were both kind of bored with the idea that I would be like, here's my writing, like pick songs or whatever. So we started writing together in Brussels when I was living there, and the songwriting method is actually pretty much the exact same thing that I teach. So I teach, you could say music theory or composition or something. And I actually, I teach basically a cumulative, lesson plan that kind of approaches the way that I write stuff with Ma.
And you designed this sort of method yourself?
I started doing it by accident. Basically, here's how the method works, and without getting technical about it.
Sure.
Sit there at the piano.
Okay.
Sometimes at the bass, really rare. And I'm like, all right, ready. And then Sarah would be like, boo-da-doo-da, or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And then I would be like, all right, do-da-do-da, find a way to harmonize that. And she would be like, no, I don't like that. I'd be like, oh, okay. What about this? She'd be like, yeah, that's cool, And so that was already like well in place when Ma and I started writing together. But it's really been through writing with Ma that it's like really developed and gotten more complicated than that. And mostly we have to fly across the world, and so we'll have like 10 days. We'll try to write a song a day, and it's like high stakes where like which affects the material.
But maybe that's a good thing in a way, because you have these sort of constraints that are, I don't know, sometimes that can be helpful to the creative process.
Sure. Yeah. Constraints are good, and kismet is good, like, and intention is good. Everything's good. It's a question of harmony and economy, like how much of this versus how much of that is always the thing, and relativity you know.
And I assume you speak French?
Pretty badly.
Then how does that work with the songs that are in French in terms of like the lyrics?
Actually, it works. I mean, we're both really, really into idioms and stuff. So we'll have a melody set, like a fragment, and we'll be singing it like shada. If I'm doing my fake French, it'll be like or whatever, and she'll be like, "Oh, that sounds like this." You know, and I'm thinking about French grammar, and I'm like, but what if it was this? And she's like, you can't say that. And I'm like, but what about this? And she's like, oh, that's like this idiom. If you cry more, you'll piss less. And I'm like, what? All right, let's put that in. And it's the same with English. Like,
right.
She'll kind of mumble words, and I'll interpret them. And, you know, it's teaching each other stuff, too. It's like...
Le pas large ouvert, l'histoire là à tes gens, sortant pour faire entendre mes enclaves ainsi allongées clairement. Chaque répondons-nous ensemble.
I'm such a Steely Dan dilettante. I haven't listened to a full record other than the Lost Gaucho, which I've listened to a lot in the last like 5 years, and by a lot I mean like a few times.
Okay.
And I've listened to the second arrangement a lot, and not just since this new amazing restoration came out, but there was a, you know, as you know, there was an earlier restoration of that work tape, and it was awesome.
There have been hundreds of restorations.
Yeah. People love that song for good reason. And you know, I have a bunch of friends who used to, I would say the whole Blanche band that from back in the day, that everybody was really, really into the Dan, and I was kind of the outlier. Kind of like I just didn't.
Well, how come, do you think?
Well, I think it just, I don't know. I love that music. I definitely listened to the Royal Scam a bunch back then, but that was like 10 years ago. I just, you know, I'm like anybody else. I get hung up on certain things, and I get obsessed with certain things. Like I got obsessed with the second arrangement for sure. I love that song. I mean, those guys are just so brilliant, and I loved Donald's book.
Eminent Hipsters.
Yeah, with the tour diary and all that. That was very relatable material, even given the huge difference in scale.
Well, some people took issue with it because they felt that he acted like a sort of spoiled rich guy. Like here was this guy who was given the spoils of, like, you know, success during the heyday of the music industry, and he was just whining about it. But I read something like that, and I'm like, I feel better about my own place in the world because someone else feels this way about things too. So I don't know. To me, something like when I read something like that, it actually makes me feel better.
Yeah, in general, like the indignities of being a musician, especially a performing musician, you're working in showbiz, you know, and I can understand somebody taking issue with it, like being like, oh, this guy's such a fucking asshole or whatever, like, oh, like all the Prince hate, you know, like that. But it's like, you know, showbiz is about being objectified and treated like shit. And I don't think that changes when you're on a bigger scale. It comes with more of a you know, gratuitous, like obsequious smile on its face, treating you like a piece of shit and objectifying you. And yeah, it's great that he got rich from it, like from writing those crazy songs. I think it's great. Good for him.
Yeah.
I have a question. Do you like the artists on that tour? Because I have a lot of regret about not seeing the Dukes of September, actually. The tour he's writing about was Boz Scaggs.
Oh, Boz Scaggs.
And Michael McDonald.
Oh, yeah. You see, Michael McDonald is a total blind spot for me. Like, I kind of know about him through the, like, he did some stuff with, like, Thundercat, right? And I heard that, and it was really cool. But I just haven't really gone down that rabbit hole. I've been down lots of other rabbit holes, and there's lots of stuff that I just don't know about. Like it's kind of weird and embarrassing to admit. Like I haven't really heard Joni's records. I haven't really heard Kate Bush's records. I haven't heard Fievel gets compared to all this like rock and opposition and like and like, what do they call it? That British progressive
Canterbury
Tales. Yeah. I haven't really heard any of that other than the Spent Slap Happy and this, and for the RIO, like Aksak Mabul. You know, I'm getting older, and I'm like less and less, all my tendencies to, you know, be an ideologue about whatever, they're like waning, and they're all eroding under my feet. And I just feel, and I've taught more and more music, you know, and teaching is such a vehicle of just like abandoning judgment. Right. You know, you're just like, all right, well, let's dig into the material. Like, I'm a materialist, you know, and, you know, so I can be catty and have some like hot takes on like whatever, but I don't really feel it anymore. I don't really care. But I think the big thing for me was like my Steely Dan was Royal Trucks. Like when I heard Thank You and Sweet 16 by Royal Trucks, I think what those records did for me is analogous to what Steely Dan has done for a lot of people. Like, I was like, this is really, really technical, really, really interesting, lyrically insane, progressive, transgressive, let's say, although I'm not fond of that whole mentality of transgressiveness. And just like really, you know, well produced, but there's an element of like controlled chaos to it. And I think that would conflict maybe with some people's ideas of Royal Trucks, but it's really those particular records like Thank You and Sweet 16 that are kind of like designed to be the big statement rock record, like progressive rock records or something. That's what they are to me anyway.
Yeah. I'm not super familiar with them. I can't honestly, I haven't listened to them at all, to be honest, but it's interesting. So you kind of took, because I mean, I've heard what they sound like, and it doesn't sound anything like the music you make. So you took certain things from that, maybe in terms of how it seeps into your influence, and then I guess it's more, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I know musicians, like great musicians I know who like, especially songwriters and stuff who claim that they listen to records and then they're like, I want that kind of sound and I want this kind of structure, whatever. I 100% every time I write, it's like tabula rasa. And with these bands and stuff, I'm not telling people what to do. Credit where credit's due. Like, some things I write for people.
Okay. And
sometimes I'll like be editorial about things, but in general, I'll write it, chart it as best I can. Usually get taught by the musicians, like in the bands, how to chart things better, and in a more understandable way. And then people bring what they bring to it, and there's some editing, and in the mixing, I have some control too.
But when a musician is doing something that you're not particularly, it's not hitting you where you wanted to hit it, do you interject, or or are all the musicians you have like 100% faith in what they're doing?
I mean, I never have 100% faith in anything. Like, do you? Well, there's different possibilities. Yeah. One thing is like you let it ride, and you're like, well, I don't really like what that person is doing right now, but maybe I'll like it later. And sometimes that's true. Other times you can counteract it, or with your own playing, or with getting somebody else to touch it. You have to feel the emotional texture of the situation. And also, I just have a huge amount of respect for musicians who practice more than I do. So I'm more resistant to like telling people what to do if I think that they shed all day.
But you must be deliberate in how you're choosing these people, because you guys, again, I'm going back to this audio tree thing, because that's for whatever reason, is the thing that I've been really engaged with of what you've done, because you all seem to really be like locked in on the same page, and maybe that's just from touring a lot together. But so are you deliberate in the people that you? I mean, how deliberate are you in terms of seeking out people to collaborate with?
I mean, how deliberate are you about like choosing your friends? You know what I mean? Like, probably not very deliberate at all, right? Like, things happen. And
Yeah.
sometimes, you know, you need, let's say you need a friend with a car, right? Like you have something specific, you need to go on a trip, and you're like, you're casting around for people, and you find out that somebody who's a friend of a friend has a car, and you're like, hey, do you want to go on this trip? And they're like, yeah, let's do it. Actually, that's convenient for me. Let's do that. And then you go on the trip, you get to know them, and you're like, oh, cool. Like, you know, now we have a rapport, and all that. It's kind of like that. It's like, except instead of a car, it's like a saxophone or something.
So you seem to invite circumstance into your world.
Oh yeah. It's not. Yeah, I don't. Yeah, when we, you know, earlier this year, our manager who we started working with, Lucas, who's becoming a really great friend of ours. He was just kind of like, you know, what are your dreams? Like, who do you want to play with? Like, who's on your radar? And what are your ambitions? Like, let's come up with some really crazy goals and try to achieve them. And me and Ma were just like, we want to get people who have already been in the band, like, paid better. And, like, these people, like, we know them and we haven't played with them yet. And he was kind of like, hey, that's not really what I meant. Like, I meant, like, do you want to play with Michael McDonald or whatever? And we're like, yeah, sure. Yeah, hell yeah. You know, it's kind of, it's like that. Yeah. But I think I told you this. One dream would certainly be to, like, open a Steely Dan show, especially knowing that they, like, don't have openers, you know?
They do sometimes. I actually saw Elvis Costello open for them.
Wow.
Yeah, sorry, Winston was there too. Yeah.
Damn.
Yeah. And they've also played with Steve Winwood and the Doobie Brothers. So sometimes
there's no action.
It's funny because Steely Dan is kind of on the other end of the spectrum. I mean, I don't know how much of the lore you know, but like during the making of Asia, they were quite literally hiring and firing entire bands.
Oh, wow.
Like they would hire a band, have the band go through some rehearsals, and then they didn't like what they were doing, so they'd say, thank you for your time. They would get paid, but that was it.
I don't know. I mean, it's just unimaginable to me. I was really influenced by my friend. Well, originally it was just a kind of like person I really admired as a musician and you know, a quote unquote thinker. I hate it when people say that, but what else are you going to call somebody sometimes? Yeah. This guy Tori Kudo from Japan has a band called Mahershala Al-Hashbaz, that I was like a super fan of growing up. There's this interview with him, it's no longer online, where he was asked a question about Fred Frith, right? Who has this relationship to, you know, these European bands that Fievel gets compared to or whatever. And I like Fred Frith. I like Skeleton Crew, this band with Tom Cora and those people. But yeah, he's asked a question like, just what does he think about Fred Frith? Or I think it's Fred Frith. I might be wrong. And Tori's response is like, you shouldn't treat people like ingredients. That's it. And so I that really resonated with me, and I would never be able to function like I think Fagan and Becker did, where it's like that. Which doesn't mean that I'm criticizing them at all. I think it's really interesting what they did. And there's a double game about it that's really, really attractive and really interesting, and part of I think why those records are so.
What do you mean by double game?
Like, they're both capable musicians, right? And they could have done a great deal more by themselves, and they could have just been like, all right, like, Purdy, you're in the band, like, we want you whenever you're available, and we want, you know, X person on bass.
They actually did try, because they were going to tour with Asia.
Yeah.
But then they realized the musicians that they wanted were guys like, you know, Bernard Purdy, and they couldn't afford to pay Purdy for a tour, or like some of these other session musicians that played on it, so they just canceled the tour. There's actually a quote of Don. Wow. There's a quote of Donald where he said, the musicians are asking to be paid a lot more than we thought we could afford, and we didn't want to be thought of as capitalists, so we just decided to scrap the entire thing.
I don't know how much budget did they put? They had a huge budget for Asia, so they just put it all toward the record.
They were there was like, because I read this book. I just found this out because I've been reading all the Steely Dan literature that's available as I do this podcast. But I was reading there was a recent Steely Dan book called Nightfly by Peter Jones, and they had all these ideas for a tour for Asia, and they actually booked dates. It was going to happen.
Yeah.
Which obviously would have greatly changed the trajectory of the band. But when they figured in all the cost of the session guys that they wanted, they just said, no, we can't do that. Like, we're just not going to do it. And they were going to play like a 40-minute instrumental suite. And
wow,
like they had all these lofty ideas about what an Asia tour would look like, and it never happened. And then they just ended up 3 years in the studio doing Gaucho, and that was that. So,
wow. And that's the last record, right?
yeah. And well, Donald did the Nightfly.
Right.
But that's Walter.
I saw something really surprising in an interview with him about it, or it's actually the press release, maybe. Well, Becker talks about how Fagen provided a lot of the harmonic direction and overall tonal framework. His ability to develop great chord sequences, striking modulations, and so on became an essential ingredient. Blah, blah, blah. So basically Becker's like ascribing like the compositional technique of Steely Dan to Fagen, which, but then he talks about not being bogged down in the harmonic complexities and ornaments that were perhaps irrelevant in the musical context of the day, which is like the Dr. Rhythm part. He's like trying to he thinks like he's tapping into the zeitgeist, which is like hilarious because the record's so bizarre. But, and the rest is just a bunch of, fluff, like the shit I was saying earlier. But then there's this other thing that he says in like another press release about it. Or it's Roger Nichols, and he's saying, Walter, when he was asked by musicians what the chords to his songs were, had to go to the MIDI sequence and look at the notes on the tracks to figure out what was going on. Nobody could agree what the correct names and chord functions of these bizarre clusters and voicings were, or even what key they were in, or in some cases where one was, which is the same as what key they're in. That just doesn't seem right. Makes it seem like maybe he didn't have a great deal of theory or something, which is cool. But Surf and or Die is really weird like that. Like, that song is very, very odd. And to me, that is like the absolute connection between Royal Trucks and Steely Dan. It's Surf and or Die.
Well, in a near random universe, there are still certain combinations picked out from all the other possible ones, which when given some time and the just right circumstances, not too far from the earth or too close to the sun, and they'll spin in the embrace of the trade winds, playing havoc with the hearts and the upturned faces down below. Till the laws of curved space-time.
I love simpler recordings. Honestly, the simpler the better. So that may be the answer to why like I'm not like super called to check out these Steely Dan studio records. They spent like years and years perfecting or whatever. Like I like quick work.
Have you checked out any of the pre-Steely Dan material? Like the Fagen and Becker demos?
Yeah, I have heard some of that.
Because that's really lo-fi and it's really cool too.
Yeah,
in its own way.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
I remember feeling like I wasn't that attracted to the songs.
Okay.
But that's what I wanted to hear of the later stuff. But that reminds me that there's some really, really good Bacharach, Hal David stuff in that vein that's like early and really weird. Like
really?
I
haven't listened to that. I love Bacharach, but
Where Knowledge Ends. Check that out. That's
a good tip. Yeah.
I was reading the lyrics along to listening to the record on the train here, and I was just like, might as well be in another language. Like, you don't even pay attention a lot of the time to what people are saying. You just can tell that, like, you pick out certain things, like in the good old bad part of this college town, you know, and you're like, that's fucking great, you know.
That's always my kind of my relationship, because a lot of Steely Dan fans, they like to really unpack like the storytelling part of it, and I've never been super attracted to that, but I do enjoy, you know, kind of lines or
there's a lot of lyrics on this that just sound fucking cool.
Yeah, they sound cool, and you can, like, if you're listening to music in a language that you don't understand, you can kind of tell when the lyrics are good, still, because it works that way in English. Because there's these dimensions, like the phonemic, how the words sound, how they're delivered, and then like just the presence of certain words just have such a lodestone power. But yeah, I found this in this interview. Becker says, the situation hasn't changed much in 20 years. It's the dichotomy that you mentioned a moment ago. The quote-unquote anarchists, or people who are interested in more interesting lyrics, are generally speaking not interested in jazz harmonies. They want something more raw and what they perceive to be subversive sounding, which usually means clanging guitars, which I think is really true, still. And then Fagan says, I think people who are sophisticated in the sense that they want to hear some substance in the lyrics are musically going to tend to be primitivists. And Becker says, or some sort of socialists. Fagan, I mean, this is like, you know, Red Scare era. Different Red Scare
This has been
era.
Screenshotted and shared on Twitter.
Really?
The
socialist thing?
Like we're social. There was a thing where they were going to do a socialist opera.
Oh.
Yeah. They were joking. It obviously was never going to happen, but they like proposed.
I mean,
yeah,
they're socialists, right? We're all socialists. There's no. I would hope that there's no controversy there at this point, and like we're, you know, enough is enough.
At one point, Walter in the song "Girlfriend," there he throws in the line, "And all at once am privy to the entire grim design of a great civilization." In the terminal stages of a slow but steady mental, moral, spiritual decline.
Yes.
And so it goes, and thus it is written, and all I want to know is, where does a guy like me fit in?
Oh my God.
See, he always lands on shit lines like that. So.
Virtual raincoats are coming back. Hats, as always, continued flat.
Yeah, I actually think Hat Too Flat is, like, if someone asked me what is the weirdest song in the entire Steely Dan universe, like, including all the Steely Dan albums and Donald and Walter solo, I would go with Hat Too Flat, because it's discordant and weird, and it's about an alien who is trying to fit in with humans.
Oh,
yeah,
that's what it is. Because it sounds like it's about writing. He's like, back at home, the machines work hard. We folk like to take it easy, honing our awareness of the finer things of life. Here, when I go down to my job, I work hard for what seems like a long time. I look at my watch, 15 minutes. It felt like half a day.
Yeah, the alien comes to Earth and realizes how shitty it is here and only pines for being back on his planet. But he's kind of making the best of the situation.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, all the lyrics on the album, like pretty much every song has a dimension of being like, there's definitely some stuff about aging, about like kind of abdicating some kind of primal youthful anger and need to stake a claim in the world that's relatable. And then there's cryptic stuff about writing, cryptic stuff about sex, the kind of lost relationship to drugs and all this stuff. It's very like it's full, it's like replete, like there's like and also these like kind of prophetic societal statements and stuff. It's fucking great. It's like it's got it all, like, and it's dumb too, which I love.
I got into it because, and this is maybe because I find it interesting, but like I got into it because when Walter died, they would cover Book of Liars on that tour, which I just think is interesting.
That's a weird one.
Yeah.
It's like not one of the better ones in my.
That's my fave.
That's your fave?
I just got obsessed with that song for some reason, and I would it was like only listening to that song, and then I got into the full album.
I take it back. That's probably one of my 4 or 5 favorites on that record.
It's just like a nice circular, simple feel. has like weird. It's always like weird verses, and then he lands on some great little pithy phrase, which I find like an inspiring way of structuring lyrics.
Super pith.
They actually, I only found this out through, taking this deeper dive into Steely Dan, but, because I hadn't realized that Steely Dan actually played a lot of Walter's songs when they were touring as Steely Dan. Like they would bring these songs to the Steely Dan band and play them live, and some of them sound amazing. Like I was, because I did an episode on an entire show, like we just listened to a Steely Dan show and like talked about it, and one like down at the bottom they do.
Oh wow!
And it's incredible. Like it
that
sounds
song is
like
so good.
Yeah, it sounds so full and like almost anthemic.
Yeah.
Which you wouldn't guess from the recording, but it's like, I don't know. I think Walter is. I feel like after hearing that, it's just like you see how Walter really was. So like I don't know. I feel like Walter always is a little bit in the shadow of Donald in terms of like people talking about who was more creatively responsible for
sure
the music that they made, and I don't know. I disagree with that.
Well, like, shit. I'm a keyboard player. I grew up playing keyboard. Who do I think is cool? Certainly not keyboard players. Guitar. I like guitarists.
Yeah.
I like wind players. I like pretty much everybody but keyboardists. And some of that Fagan stuff like that. I never got my hooks into the Nightfly.
Yeah.
It sounds like it sounds like the keyboardist made it, and that's my own criticism of a lot of the shit I've made. Is like, that sounds like a keyboardist made it. It's kind of embarrassing.
What does that mean to you?
Too much chord concept, too much awareness of how things compute. I always think about the like Ornette Coleman orientation toward the piano as kind of like enemy, that's a simplified version of this relationship to the piano, but like this idea that it and I usually talk to students about this. I'm like, this is kind of like a computer that flatlined everything, and it says that whatever octave you're in, everything has the same meaning. This became like the pedagogical, like the lingua franca of Western tonal music, like this instrument. And now, of course, like it literally is a computer. Like most people's keyboards are computers now. That is what it is. There's a lot of great stuff that comes along with that. I'm not knocking it. It's amazing. Yeah. I'm not a primitivist. I love the piano. Like it's my instrument. Mm-hmm. But there is a dimension of like the guitar is set up in such a way that people can work more readily with things like shapes and basically with their own unconscious and like gestural movements without kind of like, look, I'm a huge proponent of theory. Like it's changed my fucking life.
Yeah,
like
that's what you do. You teach it.
Yeah, and I'm very interested in it, like super, super interested in it. But the what's at stake is like, can you stay on the edge of what you know how to do? And guitarists are always right there, or not always. They can be cursed by the same thing as the keyboardist. I mean,
do you think the guitarists are more liberated because they're not tied to what like maybe some limitations on the scales or something?
Do I intellectually think that? No, I think that everybody's kind of who's playing equal tempered instruments is more or less dealing with the same shit. But do I emotionally feel that way? Yes. I will always feel that way. I'll always think guitar players are super sexy, exciting, interesting, arcane.
What about a violin player though?
Totally.
Okay.
Totally interesting. Yeah. Cello, I must admit is a harder sell for me. Just the timbre of a cello.
Okay.
But I know some great cello players, and I really like.
I'm afraid to say viola because that was my instrument.
Oh,
I played classical.
Honestly, I don't even know if I can distinguish a viola from.
Nobody can. Nobody cares
from
about the viola. That's what's great about it.
Violin.
Is you can kind of hide a little bit. That's what I appreciated about it, is that if I fucked up, no one would notice because we kind of just blend in with everything else. But,
Oh, because it would be like a huge string ensemble.
yeah, I always played with orchestras. I never played in.
Wow.
Yeah.
I can't even imagine. It sounds
Yeah.
so cool. There's just so many things to do. Like,
Yeah.
you know, I mean, in a perfect world,
Yeah.
I think we would all be able to live infinite lives and get to check out all these different ways to do things. Because, I've gone down a particular road totally by there's some intention in it, but mostly just because like it's like, oh, that, like, oh, I kind of know how to do that. Oh, that seems attractive. Oh, I want to learn that a little bit, but like it's a total accident. I would love to build electronic instruments or be or like shed all day on like flute.
Yeah.
There's just certain things where it's like, well, it's not enough time.
But you're still happy with what you're doing, though, right? At the end of the day, this is the thing you most want to be
You're not
doing.
gonna make a microtonal album.
Being on this podcast, I think that when I say heuristic, like, it's like supposed to be a learning device. So I think the best case scenario for any of us is whatever you're doing. Hopefully it's helping you would bracket the word enjoy, but find something useful and exciting about all kinds of experiential possibilities. So I would say that if your music as a listener and as a player should be opening you to more sounds and to an experience of sound that is like, fuck happiness. Like, forget about that. We can leave that far behind. That's very circumscribed. That's like a mood, right?
Yeah.
Something more useful than happiness seems available to those who learn from experience, right? Like, which means that like it can be summoned up during other kinds of moods, and it can be used to change moods and stuff. This is what's at stake. Is like, can we like? This is at the vanguard of experience, like this is why, and it can't be like a self-help module. It has to literally to come from life, from one's own life. Like you can't teach this.
You can't force these things to happen.
Yeah. I'm not down for the seminar on it.
Right.
But I think we all find it in different ways, and it's like really, that's where all the action is, really. And maybe people are finding it in podcasts or whatever. Like I feel like podcasts are like this huge repository of like opinionation usually. Like it's like, and I can't imagine like an audience that what are people looking for in all this opinionation? Like
Right.
I've tuned into some of these like these infamous podcasts for a second and just been like this is supposed to summon up some kind of like frisson, like I'm supposed to be like scandalized or like joining with some kind of like malevolent energy, like in Ghostbusters 2, like that bad vibe under the city that Vigo is.
The subway river thing, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know. We live in such a weird world, and all I know is this: people who get really materialistic, in a good way, working on whatever the fuck it is, are in a position to learn something that can't be communicated through like discourse and opinionation and all this stuff. And that is where I see Becker and Fagan accidentally inverting the usual list. That's where I see them like being really relatable, is like as materialist, not as perfectionists who made like brilliant work or whatever, but as like writers who are like digging into the fucking material and like sitting there doing the work. And as Becker said about 11 Tracks of Whack, like trying to make something out of nothing and take it all the way from nothing into a form that then the question is just how to represent that form, and that's where we diverge. That's where I don't relate to them at all.
Right.
Maybe they were in the studio that long, not because they were perfecting it, but because they're actually like destroying something that they can't handle the vulnerability of something that's like, you know, that's written all over that music's face, and they're just painstakingly erasing their own tracks.
Well, they decided not to go back to the second arrangement, even though they could have easily re-recorded it.
Yeah, and that's something attractive about them, that tells me that they recognize that sometimes special things happen that can't be replicated, which is not what a perfectionist thinks, right?
Since this second arrangement came out, actually a few people have been upset about it because they think that it should have been left alone. Like, we shouldn't be pretending that this song was supposed to be on Gaucho or like is anything close to what would have actually been on the album, because it wasn't completed.
Right, like it's not like that's revisionism.
It's revisionism, yeah.
I mean, everybody needs to just make a record and like quiet down or whatever. Like it's like it's not that holy what ends up being on a record. Like
but it ends up being that way for some people.
Well, if you think about like the majority of records that are coming through this major label pipeline that people actually know about, there is so much outside of like the quote unquote artist's intentionality that's part of, maybe Steely Dan, especially as they became super famous, had like great contractual clauses about having complete artistic control. Like such things happen. Fievel has that right now. Like nobody's going to tell us, so you can't put that song on your album or whatever. But like, you know, most of the time there's a huge amount of influence from other people. And so I say all the anti-revisionists are just as guilty of revisionism. And I think that I don't give a fuck what's on Gaucho. I think it's significant that song came about at a particular time. That is like the Gaucho crop or whatever. That seems important. But at the end of the day, it's just a great song, great recording, great arrangement. And it's cool that it reached us as this kind of like artifact that like isn't as hi-fi as like the usual Dan thing, but it's like we've been hearing progressively like better rips of it for like, you know, I don't know, 20 years or something.
One thing I found fascinating is that literally within hours after the release, people were already starting to patch together the different versions. Like they were taking, because there were lines missing even from this new hi-fi version.
Oh, wow.
So literally, like, I saw one response was like, this is cool. Like, this is better than what we've had to work with from before. Like, they didn't even see it as this is the, like, finally we have the version. It was like, this was just another piece in this, like, ongoing I don't know, like I've kind of referred to it as like kind of this collaborative art project, because that's what it is. It's like everyone, and it's kind of happening in this virtual space because like people will do like this, you know, they'll add this thing to it and then they'll send it to their friends, and then they said I took the horns from this cover band. Like there was this cover band that,
oh shit,
because there's
really cool.
There's a lot of cover band versions too.
Yeah.
So it's like they're mixing together like the cover versions with like the different demos. So it's like Donald's vocals and then like the horns from this Anthony Robustelli recording. So yeah,
this is
it's
where the renaissance that you have tapped into kind of starts to intersect with the Dead thing or something.
a little bit, yeah.
Because like
the fandom takes on a life of
there's
its
this
own
tension
outside
between
of
like revering the LP as like, which you're like, fuck that, who cares? Like the LP is like the post 1960s whatever, like totem of like this is the final thing and this is sacred, and like they, in a way they're all about that. They're like the ultimate example of that, to the like whatever. Asia's budget was crazy and then they spent it all on that so they couldn't tour, like that whole thing. But then there's this whole lore of like all this stuff that was deleted, all the solos by like the greatest jazz post-bop jazz musicians ever that like
and they just deleted all that
like
shit,
it. And so it's ripe for like, but yeah, like this sort of sanctity. It's like it's a weird tension of like, yeah, these people who believe and totemize different aspects of it, like, you know.
I mean, what a wicked.
We're not supposed to hear it because it's not on the record. Like, it's such a weird. I don't know. You know what I mean?
What a wicked game! Like to just be like getting like people like in over and over, and they're just like cutting solos, and then you just delete it and stuff. But about that fan project thing and all that. Like the analogy that came to me is like the Bible or like the Supreme Court or something, like this idea of like originalism, right? Like that there would be like a way to be faithful to the original intention of like the founding fathers or to the motley crew that wrote what became the New Testament after like a million re-edits and all this stuff. And there's all these people who want to fix things and essentialize things, and then because their whole relationship to the thing is based on the idea of its fixity, and that is like maybe the unhealthy part of fetishism that like we can all relate to, like, and then we all know the joys of like the fun parts of fetishism that maybe like have to do with the abrogation of that fixity and like the confusion and like with the object and all that. Right. And that's like, I think if you're a writer, like you got to join with that ultimately. And so it's cool that people are like doing these piecemeal weird ass gestures of like fanhood by like being like, but what if it was like this, That's so cool and hypothetical and writerly. Like that's joining with like the ethos of those guys almost as much as it would be joining with the ethos to just write your own fucking stuff.
J'accroche à la lecture de ton